The auctioneer did not bother to lower his voice when he said the girl had wasted $1, and the men beside him laughed the easy laugh of people who would never be wrong in any way that cost them. It was a cold morning in the spring of 1887 in a sale yard at the edge of Drumlin, a small cattle town in the Montana Territory where the wind came down off the Bitterroot foothills and found every gap in a person's coat. The thing she had bought stood at the back of the lot, under a tarp gone stiff with frost. It was a bunkhouse, or what was left of one, the last building from a foreclosed ranch the bank had stripped of everything it could carry off, and it had gone to her for $1 because no one else in the yard wanted a windowless shed full of a dead man's leavings. She was 18 years old. She had slept the night before in a livery stall, and she had $4 more folded in the lining of her glove, and she stood with her hand flat against the cold plank wall of the thing she now owned and felt, for the first time in a long while, that something in the world was hers. Her name was Lottie Vance, and 3 weeks earlier, she had not been homeless and she had not been alone. But the territory does not slow down to let a person catch up to grief. What she did not yet know was that inside that bunkhouse, under a floor she had not yet pried up, sat an iron trunk locked with a mechanism that no one in Drumlin had been able to open, and that the lock had been built by the one man on earth who had taught her how such locks were made. Stay with me, because the $1 she spent that morning was about to undo a theft that the whole valley had agreed to forget. She had come to Montana the year before with her grandfather, a locksmith named Asa Mercer, who had worked 40 years at a bench in St. Louis before his lungs turned bad, and a doctor told him mountain air might buy him time. It bought him 14 months. He died in February in a rented room with the window open because he said he could not breathe with it shut, and he left her his tools, his hand's worth of knowledge, and nothing else, because the landlord took the rest against what they owed. Asa Mercer had taught her the trade the way other men taught their sons. He had sat her at the bench when she was 9 and put a worn brass padlock in her palm, and told her that a lock was only a question, and that every question had an answer if you were patient enough to listen for the tumblers to tell you where they wanted to fall. He had a way of talking about iron as though it were alive and reasonable. He would say that you never forced a good lock, because forcing it only taught it to resist you, and that the secret of the trade was not strength but attention. She had heard it so many times that the words had worn smooth in her memory like a coin handled too long. Work with the grain of the thing, he told her, and it will open for you. Work against it, and it will fight you to the last. She had not understood when she was 9 that he was teaching her more than locks. When he died, she had no money for a stage ticket east, and no family to take her in if she got there. She sold what she could and lived on it through a thin month, and when the last of it ran out, she walked out to the sale yard because she had heard a foreclosed ranch was going under the hammer, and she thought there might be tools in the lots, files and rasps she could carry and sell. She had not meant to buy anything, she had meant to watch and bide. Then the bunkhouse came up and the auctioneer made his joke about the dead man's shed, and no hand went up, and something turned over in her, some refusal she could not have named, and she heard her own voice say $1 before she had decided to spend it. The dead man had been Elias Rowe, and the laughter that followed her bid was partly about her and partly about him, because Elias Rowe was a story the town told to feel better about itself. He had run cattle on a good section of bottomland north of town for 30 years, a hard, quiet man who kept to his own fences and did not drink with anyone, and 4 years back he had died alone in a hard winter, and his ranch had gone to the Drumlin Stock and Land Bank for debts no one had ever seen him incur. The bank had sold the land and the herd and the good timber, and what was left, the bunkhouse and the cook shack and a wagon with a cracked axle, had sat in a backlot waiting for a fool. Lottie was the fool. She did not mind being called one. A fool, her grandfather used to say, is only a person who knows something. The clever have not bothered to learn. A man near the rail had turned to look at her when she made her bid, a freighter in a sheepskin coat with a face red from weather, and he had said loud enough for the yard to hear that the dead man's ghost would be glad of the company, and the men around him had laughed again, easier this time. Another, a thin clerk sort with ink on his cuffs, asked the auctioneer whether the girl understood she could not even lift a building, let alone haul one, and the auctioneer had said, dry as the dust on the lots, that she had bought it, and the bank was glad of the dollar, and the rest was her affair. Lottie had stood through all of it with her chin level and her eyes on the tarp at the back of the lot. She had learned, in the year of her grandfather's dying, that the surest way to keep a thing was to want it quietly, where no one could see the want and think to take it from her. She let them laugh. The laughter cost her nothing, and the building was hers, and the men who laughed would go home that night to houses they had not had to fight for, and would forget her by morning. The yardmaster gave her a key to the back gate and told her she had until the end of the month to haul her purchase off the lot or forfeit it, and he said it the way a man says a thing he expects to come true. She thanked him and walked back to the bunkhouse with the cold getting into her boots. It was a low building, 12 feet by 20, built of squared logs, chinked with clay, the roof sagging where snow had sat on it for 4 winters with no one to sweep it clear. The door hung on one hinge. Inside, it smelled of mice and old smoke, and the particular mineral cold of a place that has not held a living body in a long time. There were 4 bunk frames bolted to the walls, a sheet iron stove rusted through at the base, a table with one leg splinted, and dust over everything like a gray snowfall that had settled and stayed. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust and did what her grandfather had taught her to do in any unfamiliar place, which was to look before she touched. She looked at the way the light came through, the gaps in the chinking, the thin gold blades of it lying across the dust. She looked at the floor, rough planks, laid green and shrunk apart with age, and she saw that in one corner, under the farthest bunk, the planks ran a different direction than the rest, crosswise where everything else lay lengthwise, as though that small square of floor had been laid by a different hand or at a different time. It was the kind of thing no one would notice who was not in the habit of noticing. Asa Mercer had been in that habit, and he had passed it to her like a color of the eyes. She did not pry the floor up that first day. She had no lamp, and the light was failing, and a thing worth finding was worth finding. In the morning, when she could see her hands, she swept a corner clear. With a broken broom she found leaning in the cook shack, spread her bedroll, and ate the last of a loaf she had carried from town. That night the wind worked at the door, and the cold came up through the floor, and she lay awake a long time listening to the building settle and thinking about the crosswise planks. A house keeps its secrets in the places. People stop looking. Her grandfather had said that too, though he had been talking about the inside of a strongbox at the time, and she had not known it would ever mean a floor. In the morning, she went to work. She had a pry bar from her grandfather's roll of tools, a flat iron bar worn bright at the working end, and she fitted it into the seam between the crosswise planks and the rest, and leaned on it the way he had taught her, steady, letting the iron do the asking. The first plank came up with a long shriek of old nails giving way. The second came easier. Under them, set into the dirt and the cribbed log foundation, was a wooden hatch the size of a stove lid, and under the hatch was a cavity lined with flat stones, and in the cavity, wedged so it could not shift, sat an iron trunk. It was not large. It was perhaps 2 feet long and a foot deep, banded with strap iron. The lid fitted close, and on the front of it was a lock. She knew the lock before she knew anything else about the trunk. She knew it the way you know a face across a crowded room before you have placed the name. It was a lever lock of a particular pattern, a 6-lever mechanism with a brass escutcheon shaped like a narrow shield, and the maker's mark stamped into the brass was a small 5-pointed star inside a circle. Her grandfather had used that mark for 40 years. He had stamped it into every lock he ever built, and he had built this one, and she was kneeling on the floor of a dead stranger's bunkhouse in the Montana Territory, looking at her grandfather's work in a place he had never been. For a moment, she could not move. The cold of the stone cavity came up through her knees, and she did not feel it. She was thinking about how a lock her grandfather had made in St. Louis had come to be buried under a foreclosed ranch 1,000 miles away, and the only answer that made any sense was the one that frightened her, which was that nothing about the dollar she had spent was an accident, and that she had been pulled to this floor by a line laid down long before she was born. She did not have the key. She did not need the key, however, because she had the hands that had made the lock, or near enough, and she had been opening her grandfather's locks since before she could spell her own name. She sat down cross-legged on the cold planks and took her picks from the roll and began to listen to the trunk the way he had taught her to listen, with her eyes closed and her whole attention narrowed to the small ticking world inside the brass. A 6-lever lock is a patient thing. Each lever must be lifted to its exact height, no more and no less, and held there while the next is found, and the levers do not want to cooperate, and the old grease inside had gone to varnish in 4 years of cold. She worked through the first morning, and the lock did not open. The brass was cold enough to ache the pads of her fingers, and the tension wrench, a thin strip of steel her grandfather had ground himself, kept slipping from the small purchase she could find for it. She warmed the lock with her breath and with a cloth heated at the stove, and the warming softened the old grease enough that the first lever rose for her and then sank back when she lost it. She worked through the afternoon and lifted 3 of the 6 levers and lost them when her hand cramped and had to begin again, opening her fist slow against the cramp, flexing the fingers, starting once more from the first lever as though the lost work had never happened. She did not curse the lock. Cursing a lock, her grandfather said, was a way of telling it you had given up. She rested her hand, ate a little, warmed her fingers at a fire she built in the broken stove, with the worst of the bad planks, and went back to it. On the second day she lifted 4 levers and held them and felt the 5th begin to give. And then the light failed again, and she would not work a lock. She could not see. She lay that night with her hands tucked into her armpits to keep the cold out of the joints, because a locksmith's whole fortune is in her hands, and her grandfather had drilled into her that you guard them the way a rider guards his horse's legs. She thought, lying there, of how many of his own locks the old man had picked open for her as lessons, setting them in her palm one after another, brass and iron, warded and lever and pin, telling her each time that the lock was not her enemy and was not her friend either, that it was only a question patiently asked and patiently answered, and that the day she got angry at one was the day she should set down her picks and take up some other trade. On the 3rd day the wind dropped and the sun came thin through the door, and she sat in the one patch of warmth it made on the floor, and put the picks back into the brass and closed her eyes and found the levers one by one. The 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, each lifting to its height, and staying, and then the 6th, the stubborn one. Rising under the pick with the smallest tremor she felt more than heard, and the bolt drew back with a sound like a held breath let go. She sat very still. She did not open the lid at once. A thing, sealed for years, deserves a moment of its own before the air gets to it. Then she lifted the lid, and the cold breath of 4 winters came out of the trunk, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and dark, was not money, and not gold, and not any of the things a town imagines when it imagines what a hard, quiet man might bury under his floor. Inside was paper. The trunk was full of paper, ledgers and letters and folded deeds, and lying on top of all of it, where it would be seen first, was a single sheet in a careful hand, and at the top of the sheet were the words to whoever opens this. Alias Rowe had known he would not be the one to open it. That was the first thing the letter told her. He had written it in the last autumn of his life, when he understood what was being done to him, and understood that he could not stop it alone, and he had sealed it in a lock he trusted because he had bought it 40 years before from a young locksmith in St. Louis named Mercer, who had told him that a lock was only a question with an answer for the patient. Elias Rowe had remembered that. He had written it down. And, reading it, Lottie understood that her grandfather had reached out of his grave and put his own granddaughter at the one floor in the territory where his work waited, and she stopped believing in accidents for the rest of her life. The letter laid it out plainly, in the flat, careful way of a man who had rehearsed the telling many times in his own head. Elias Rowe had not died in debt. He had died solvent, with his land paid clear and money in 2 banks, and the debts that had taken his ranch had been manufactured note by the president of the Drumlin Stock and Land Bank, a man named Harlan Pike. The letter named him. It named the dates. It described how Pike had held Rowe's mortgage and how in the years after Rowe's wife died and the old man stopped coming to town, Pike had begun to enter loans against the ranch in the bank's books. Loans Rowe had never taken, with Rowe's signature forged at the bottom in a hand that improved with practice. The ledgers in the trunk were Rowe's own, kept in his own hand, and they showed every true payment he had ever made, and the dates he made them, and against them the bank's claimed debts stood revealed as the inventions they were. There was more, and it was worse, and it was the part that turned Lottie's quiet anger into something colder and more useful. Rowe had not been the only one. The letter named 4 other families, small holders north of town, whose land had gone to the bank in the same years for debts that did not match anything they remembered owing. Rowe had figured it out the way a careful man figures things out, by listening at the edges of conversations and writing down what did not add up, and he had gathered what proof he could: copies of notes, a page torn from a payment book a clerk had let him see, 2 letters from a neighbor describing a loan he had never signed. He had meant to take it to the territorial court. Then the hard winter had come and taken him before he could, and the trunk had gone under the floor with the rest, and Harlan Pike had foreclosed on a dead man and slept easy for 4 years. Lottie read the letter 3 times. Then she wrapped it again in its oilcloth and sat in the cold with her grandfather's lock open in her lap, and thought about what a person with nothing was supposed to do with a thing like this. She was 18. She had $4 and a roll of tools, and a bunkhouse she had 3 weeks to move. The man named in the letter ran the bank, and the bank ran the town, and there was no one in Drumlin she could name who was not in some way beholden to Harlan Pike. A clever person would have seen that the safest thing was to take the deeds that might be worth money, sell them quiet, and ride out before anyone knew the trunk had been opened. Lottie was not clever in that way. She had been raised by a man who believed that the answer to a question, once found, belonged to whoever had been wronged by its being hidden. The old man who had figured prominently in Rowe's letter, the neighbor who had written about a loan he never signed, was still alive. His name was in the letter, Tobias Frame, and Lottie learned by asking carefully at the feed store that he was an old widower who lived alone in a soddy west of town and had lost his quarter section to the bank the same year Rowe lost his ranch, and that he was thought to be a little soft in the head now because he still told anyone who would listen that he had never borrowed against his land. People nodded at him and went on. A man who keeps insisting on a truth no one will hear comes in time to look like a fool. Lottie knew exactly how that felt. She walked out to the soddy on a gray afternoon with the letter and one of Rowe's ledgers wrapped in oilcloth under her arm. The soddy sat low in a fold of prairie with grass growing thick across its roof, so that from a distance it looked less like a house than like a green hummock the land had pushed up of its own accord. A thread of smoke stood straight from the stovepipe in the still air. Tobias Frame met her at his door with the suspicion of a man who had learned that visitors brought trouble. A tall, stooped old man with a white beard stained yellow at the corners of his mouth and a hand that did not leave the doorframe, and he did not soften until she said the name Elias Rowe and watched something wake up behind his eyes. He stood looking at her a long moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. The inside of the soddy was clean and bare and poor, a single room with a packed earth floor swept smooth, a narrow bed, a shelf of 3 books, and a table he had made himself from packing crates. He gave her the one chair and sat on the edge of the bed. She laid the letter open on the crate table and read him the part that named him, and the old man put his face in his 2 hands and was quiet a long time. And when he looked up, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. He said that for 4 years he had believed he was either a thief who had forgotten his own crime, or a madman, and that he could not have told her which fear was worse. He said no one had believed him. He said his own son had stopped speaking to him over it, had told him to his face to let it go before he shamed the family worse, and had driven off down the track and not come back. He told her the rest. Then the parts Rose letter could not contain the names of the other families and where they had scattered to, the daughter of one who clerked now at the hotel, the 2 sons of another who freighted ore down from the mines. He told her that Harlan Pike had grown fat and respectable on the land he had stolen, that he sat on the church board and had given the money for the new schoolhouse bell, and that the whole town had agreed without ever saying so out loud that it was easier to call a few old men liars than to call the banker a thief. He said it without heat, the way a man states whether he has lived under so long he has stopped fighting it. Lottie listened and wrote down everything in a small book she carried, the dates and the names and the order of things, because her grandfather had taught her that a thing written down at the time is worth 10 things remembered later. When she rose to go, the old man caught her sleeve and asked her, almost afraid to, whether she meant to do something with the papers, or only to show a dying man he had not been mad. She told him she meant to do something. He nodded slowly as though the word were a weight. He had to learn again how to carry "Here is the part you came for, and I will not rush it." There was never a moment when Lottie Vance confronted Harlan Pike. She never raised her voice to him, never stood in his bank and named his crime, never gave him the satisfaction of a scene he could have called the ravings of a vengeful girl. What she did was slower and heavier and could not be argued with. She did with the proof what Roe had meant to do and had not lived to finish. She needed help she did not have. She was 18 and unknown and a woman, and a sheaf of old papers in such hands would be dismissed as forgery or theft before it was ever read. So she went with Tobias Frame walking beside her, to vouch that she was who she said to the one person in the valley who stood outside Pike's reach, a circuit lawyer named Della Hart, who kept a small office above the harness shop and took the cases no one else would, mostly because no one else paid her enough to make her cautious. Della Hart read the letter and the ledgers at her desk by lamplight while Lottie and the old man sat across from her, and she read them twice. And when she finished, she took off her spectacles and rubbed the marks they left on her nose and said, in the dry way of a person who has learned not to hope too loudly, that in 20 years she had never held an instrument that would do what these would do. The trade had taught Lottie that the work once begun must be carried to its end with the same patience it was begun with, and the carrying took the better part of 2 months. Della Hart knew how to move papers through a territorial court the way Lottie knew how to move levers in a lock, and the 2 of them, the old lawyer and the young locksmith, made an odd and effective pair. They worked in the lamplit office above the harness shop most evenings, the smell of leather and neatsfoot oil coming up through the floorboards, Della Hart copying Roe's figures into a clean hand for the court, while Lottie laid the original ledgers beside the bank's certified statements and marked, line by line, every place where a payment Roe had recorded did not appear, and every loan the bank claimed that Roe's own book did not know. It was slow work, and it suited her. It was the same work as the lock, only larger and made of numbers instead of levers, and it asked the same thing of her, which was to find where the false thing did not match the true thing, and to keep her attention on the seam until it gave. They did not accuse. They filed. They entered Roe's ledgers into the record alongside the bank's, and they brought a clerk who had since left the bank and had reason to dislike the man who had let him go, and the clerk, under oath and with his hand shaking, confirmed that he had seen entries made in Roe's account in the year after Roe's wife died, and had been told it was none of his concern. Lottie had found the clerk herself, tracking him to a boarding house 2 towns over by asking Tobias Frame who else had worked the bank's counter in those years, and she had not pressed him or paid him, only laid the ledgers on his table and let the figures do their own asking. And the man had looked at them a long while and said that he had carried the weight of those entries for 4 years and would be glad to set it down. Harlan Pike did not appear in any of this as a villain in a story, appears raging and cornered. He appeared as a name on a record that no longer matched the truth set beside it. When the discrepancies were laid out, page against page, true ledger against false, his forged signatures against the dozen genuine ones the court could compare them to, there was nothing for him to fight. He hired 2 lawyers from the territorial capital, and they argued the papers were stolen, which was true, and that stolen papers should not be admitted, and the judge, an old man who had watched the valley fill up with banks and was not sorry to see one of them embarrassed, ruled that the manner of a document's finding did not change what it said. It came apart for Pike, not in a single hour, but over weeks, the way a foundation goes, one stone shifting and then the wall above it. The territorial examiner came up from the capital to look at the bank's books, and what he found there matched what Roe had written in the last autumn of his life. And once the examiner's report existed, the depositors began to come for their money, and a bank that cannot pay its depositors is a dead thing, whatever the courts decide. Pike was not shot, and he was not hanged, and he was not run out of town on a rail. He simply ceased, over a season, to be a man anyone needed to please. The church board found reasons to thin its membership. The schoolhouse bell kept ringing, and after a while, no one remembered who had paid for it. He left Drumlin the following spring on the morning stage with 2 trunks and no one to see him off. And the valley closed over the space where he had been the way water closes over a dropped stone. What mattered to Lottie was never Pike. It was the part that came after, the part her grandfather would have called the only part worth the trouble. The court did not merely void the false debts. It found that the foreclosures built on them were themselves void, and it ordered the bank's receiver to make the wronged families whole as far as the bank's remaining assets allowed, which was not fully, because much had been spent, but more than any of them had dared imagine. Tobias Frame got his quarter section back. He was too old to work it, and he knew it, and he deeded it to his son. And the deeding of it was the thing that brought the son back to his door after 4 silent years, and the old man told Lottie that he did not care about the land at all next to the site of his boy's wagon coming up the track. The daughter who clerked at the hotel got the value of her father's lost claim and used it to stop clerking and to send for a sister who had been kept by relations back in Iowa, so that the 2 of them were under one roof again for the first time since the foreclosure had scattered them. The 2 freighting sons got theirs and bought a 3rd wagon and a better team, and the elder of them came to Lottie's shop the next spring to have a strong box fitted for the route, and he paid her without a word about the past, which she understood to be his way of saying. And the land that had been Elias Roe's, the good bottom land north of town, came back into the estate of a man with no heirs, and the court, having no one else to give it to and being made aware by Della Hart of exactly whose patient hands had brought the whole matter to light, awarded a portion of the proceeds of its sale to the girl who had opened the trunk. It was not a fortune. It was enough. Enough for a small place at the edge of town with a shed she could fit out as a shop, and a sign she lettered herself and hung over the door, which said only that locks were made and opened there. She kept the trunk. She cleaned the iron and oiled the lock and set it on a shelf in the shop where she could see it from the bench, and she did not use it to store anything, because it had already held the only thing it ever needed to hold. people in Drumlin learned slowly the way towns learn things they would rather not, what the girl with the dollar had done. And the men who had laughed in the sale yard found they had business at her shop after all, because she was, it turned out, the only locksmith for 60 miles, and a good one. They did not apologize. She did not expect them to. A man does not easily say he was wrong about a thing he laughed at. Still, they brought her their work, and they paid her fair, and one or two of them, the better ones, took off their hats when they came in, and that was apology enough in the currency of that country. Tobias Frame came to see her on the day his son moved back onto the quarter section, and he brought her a thing wrapped in a feed sack, and when she opened it she found it was a small iron strongbox, dented and old, that he said had been his wife's and had a broken lock and was no use to anyone, but that he thought a locksmith might want a thing that needed mending. She mended it. She gave it back to him with the lock running smooth and would not take his money. And he stood in the doorway of her shop, turning his hat in his hands, and said that she had given him back his mind, that for 4 years he had thought the fault was in him, and that the worst of being robbed was not the loss of the land, but the loss of his own certainty that he had remembered his life correctly. She told him that the fault had never been in him. She told him that the proof had only been waiting under a floor for the right hand to lift it. She did not say that the right hand had been her grandfather's as much as her own. Some debts a person keeps to herself. Delahart and Lottie remained friends in the dry, undemonstrative way of two people who have done hard work together, and the lawyer said once, over coffee, that she had spent 20 years believing that the law was the only lever, long enough to move a wrong that big, and that she had learned from an 18-year-old that the law was only the handle, and that the lever was a thing somebody had to find first and have the patience to lift. Lottie said that her grandfather had told her something close to that about locks, and Delahart said she would have liked to meet the old man, and Lottie said that in a way she had. She lived a long time in Drumlin. She married, in her own time and on her own terms, a quiet man who shod horses 2 doors down and who understood without being told that her bench came first and her tools were not to be borrowed, and she raised 2 daughters and taught them both the trade at the same bench where she had learned it, putting a worn brass padlock in each small palm at the age of 9 and telling her that a lock was only a question, and that every question had an answer if you were patient enough to listen. The younger one took to it. The older one did not, and went off to teach school, and that was allowed, because Asa Mercer had taught his granddaughter that you do not force a thing that wants to open in another direction. The freight car of years carried off the people who had laughed and brought up new people who knew the story only as a thing the town told. The way Drumlin had once told the story of Elias Rowe to feel better about itself, only now the story ran the other way, and it was about a girl and a dollar and a locked trunk, and in the telling it grew the way such stories grow, until in some versions the trunk had been full of gold after all. Lottie let them tell it however they liked. She knew what had been in the trunk. Paper was worth more than gold that year, and she had known it the moment she lifted the lid, and the knowing was hers and did not need defending. In her old age, with her hands too stiff for the fine work and her eyes gone soft at the edges, she would sit in the patch of afternoon light that came through the shop window and look at the trunk on its shelf and at the small star inside a circle stamped in its brass, and she would think about the morning she had spent $1, and the men who had laughed and the floor laid crosswise in a dead man's bunkhouse. She had bought, for $1, the one thing that clever men in the yard had not known how to want. She had bought a question, and she had been, all her life, patient enough to listen for the answer. The trunk is still in that country, they say, kept by a great-granddaughter who fits locks in a town not far from where Drumlin used to be, and on its brass there is still a small 5-pointed star inside a circle, worn now almost smooth by 100 years of hands that could not pass it without touching it. What would you have done if you had been 18 and had nothing and had found a wrong like that waiting under your feet? Sit with that a while. And if a story of a thing buried and brought back to light is the kind of thing that holds you, there is another I can tell you, about a woman and a wrecked stagecoach in a canyon that no one had been able to reach.